what if the ultimate reward for years of grueling spiritual, psychological, or, personal self-improvement wasn't levitation or eternal bliss or some kind of superhuman aura,
Right.
but simply the ability to do your laundry without complaining?
I mean, it is honestly the most disappointing pitch for enlightenment ever written.
Seriously.
And yet it might be the most accurate.
Yeah.
Because we are completely obsessed with the lightning strike of the breakthrough, but we have almost zero cultural framework for the reality of, the Tuesday morning after.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are exploring the morning after. We're looking at what happens following a massive paradigm shift in your life. You've done the shadow work, you've deconstructed your ego, you've had the realization, the mountain has been climbed.
Yeah, the big moment.
Exactly. But suddenly you wake up and the sink is still full of dirty dishes. The property taxes are still due. Your dog still needs to be walked in the freezing rain. How do you keep living in the ordinary world when your internal architecture has been irrevocably altered?
So to map this out, we are diving into a specific phase of psychological and spiritual alchemy known as the Albedo. Specifically, we're looking at the mechanics detailed in a chapter titled Chop Wood, Carry Water.
Such a classic title.
It is. And what makes this framework so vital is its sheer brutal practicality. It just strips away all the mystical glamour and replaces it with the raw physics of consciousness.
To set the baseline for just how unglamorous we are talking, let's start with layman Pang.
Yeah.
We have this grounding quote from the 8th century Buddhist figure. He writes, "My daily activities are not unusual, I'm just naturally in harmony with them. Supernatural power and marvelous activity, drawing water and carrying firewood."
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately. Because if you tell a high-achieving, modern person who just spent a decade meditating or in intense psychoanalysis that their grand prize is a chore wheel.
Oh, they're going to ask for a refund. They absolutely would. Because we have this deeply ingrained assumption that insight buys us an exemption from the menial friction of survival. We think, I have seen the fundamental truth of anatta, of non-self. I shouldn't have to wait in line at the DMV.
Right, I'm above the DMV now.
Exactly. But Layman Pang completely inverts that. He isn't saying that doing chores is the price you pay to be enlightened. He's saying the unresisted, harmonious execution of the mundane task is the supernatural power.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the magic isn't in escaping the water bucket. It's in the complete absence of internal friction while carrying it.
Which brings us to this incredible collision between expectation and reality. Following what the framework calls the Negredo phase, that intense, often painful structural dismantling of the ego and the realization of non-self, the initiate almost always anticipates a state of permanent radiance.
Right, you expect a glowing halo.
Yeah, you expect to be glowing, you expect the world to just bend to your new frequency, but instead you hit what is brilliantly termed a dreadful sobriety.
And what's fascinating here is that phrase, dreadful sobriety, is clinically precise. Why dreadful? If you have just pierced the veil of illusion, shouldn't you feel elated? Shouldn't you feel like you're floating?
You would really think so, but the dread comes from the realization that the external world continues totally unchanged. The change is entirely in the relationship to the experience, not the content of the experience itself.
The universe doesn't care about your breakthrough.
Right. The calories still need to be consumed, the trash still needs to go out. But I want to dig into the somatic experience of that dread. Why does clarity feel dreadful in the beginning?
Well, because it's violently stripped of all the romantic projections that previously made the ego feel special and alive. When you think about the sheer volume of daily energy fueled by intoxicating narratives.
Oh, yeah.
When you're operating from an unexamined ego, you aren't just sending an email to a client. You are advancing your vital career trajectory.
Building an empire. Right. You aren't just buying a car, you are establishing dominance in your social hierarchy. The ego feeds on the drama of ambition. It loves social posturing. It loves the desperate hunger for validation. That drama creates a massive gravitational pull. It's intoxicating.
And after the structural dismantling of the self, that gravitational pull just abruptly turns off. You experience a total withdrawal of investment from the social game. You look at the things that used to keep you awake at night, the promotions, the arguments on Twitter, the desperate need to be perceived as the smartest person in the room, and you feel absolute zero, no pull.
Exactly. The apparent reality of the social game loses its absolute power over you. You see the matrix of social incentives for what it is, which is just a game of arbitrary tokens.
Yeah.
And while seeing through that game is objectively liberating, the initial shock of withdrawal leaves you in a stark, unadorned landscape. The intoxicating drama is gone. The adrenaline of defending your self-image is gone. You are just left staring at the raw mechanics of existence.
And to an ego that's used to feasting on drama, that sobriety feels dreadful. It feels like a void.
I see the distinction, and let me challenge this for a second. Isn't there a massive danger of self-deception here? Because if you describe someone who has lost all ambition, who feels no pull towards social validation, and who views the world without any romantic projection, you are literally describing the clinical diagnostic criteria for severe depression.
Yes.
So how do you know you're experiencing the rock-like stability of the albedo phase, and not just a highly sophisticated, spiritualized form of apathy?
It's a critical challenge. And honestly, it's a trap a lot of people fall into. From the outside, the two states can look remarkably similar.
They really do.
If you observe someone who has completely dropped out of the frantic rat race of social posturing, they might appear passive or detached. But the internal mechanics are completely divergent. Depression is fundamentally characterized by a collapse of vitality. It is a heaviness. It's often accompanied by a paralyzing inner monologue of self-criticism, like a feeling of being crushed by a rigid, oppressive sense of self.
Right. Depression is incredibly egocentric. Even if it's negative ego, it's all about I am terrible, I am trapped.
Precisely. This dreadful sobriety, on the other hand, is the absence of illusion, not the absence of vitality. The internal state is described as rock-like stability because the egoic defense mechanisms have evaporated.
Yeah.
There is no fragile self-image left to defend.
Okay, that makes sense.
Therefore, outwardly, the behavior becomes highly fluid. A depressed person is rigid. They can't adapt to the moment because they are crushed by their internal narrative. The integrated practitioner in this phase is highly adaptive. They move exactly as the situation requires, with full energy and precision, but without any hungry attachment to the outcome.
So let's use a mechanical analogy. Depression is a car that won't start because the transmission is shattered and the engine is flooded. It's broken. The albedo phase is a high-performance sports car with a pristine engine, but it's currently idling in neutral.
I love that.
It's perfectly capable of driving 150 miles an hour, but there is simply no immediate functional necessity to hit the gas. The energy is fully available. It's just no longer being squandered on a race it has realized is completely arbitrary.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize it. The fuel isn't gone. It's just being conserved. And this brings us to a massive practical problem that the architecture of this phase has to solve. If the old motivations are gone, if the car is sitting in neutral and you are no longer driven by the frantic hunger for money, status, or validation, what actually gets the car into gear, why get out of bed?
Exactly. If the self that used to panic about being late for work is dead, why do you still go to work? And this brings us to the core concept of the architecture of routine. To understand how this works mechanically, we need to analyze a very specific visual metaphor provided in the framework. It's an illustration that encodes this entire philosophy.
Let's construct the image for everyone listening. We see a figure walking away from us down a dirt path. They are dressed in a simple, rust-colored robe, a gray cloth tied around their head. Across their shoulders rests a heavy wooden yoke, and hanging from each end of the yoke is a large wooden bucket filled to the brim with water.
Classic imagery.
Right. But on the ground behind them, lying in the dirt path they just traversed, are heavy iron chains, and the links are clearly shattered. To the left of the path, there is a large tree stump with a heavy iron axe embedded deeply into the wood. To the right, a small, meticulously controlled campfire is burning.
Every single piece of this is a technical symbol. Let's start with the shattered chains in the dirt behind them. This clearly represents the negrito phase. The chains are broken, the karmic conditioning, the illusions, the egoic attachments that used to bind this person have been completely shattered. The prisoner is free.
They are free. But look at what the freed person's doing. This is the crux of the entire chapter. They aren't levitating into the cosmos in the halo of golden light. They aren't sitting under a tree in eternal bliss. They are physically bearing a massive burden. They're carrying 2 incredibly heavy buckets of water.
So the newfound freedom is immediately applied to a grounding, utilitarian, physical task. Why? I mean, why go from slavery straight to manual labor?
Because of the concept of routine as a containment vessel. In the immediate aftermath of ego death, the practitioner is in a highly volatile state.
Oh, volatile. Okay.
Yeah, the old rigid structures of egoic motivation have collapsed, but the new spontaneous responsiveness of the spirit hasn't fully stabilized yet. If you don't contain it, that energy will dissipate, or worse, it will start to warp and spin out into new, bizarre delusions.
It makes me think of the process of forging steel. When you melt down scrap metal, which is essentially what the Negrito phase did to the conditioned personality, you create this incredibly pure, radiant substance. Molten steel is glowing, it's hot, it's pure, but it's also liquid, it's highly volatile, it has no shape and no utility. If you just pour molten steel onto the ground, it will spill everywhere, start a fire, and eventually cool into a useless random puddle. To make it functional, to stabilize it, you have to pour that molten metal into a mold.
Yes, and a mold is inherently restrictive. It's rigid. It's boring.
Right. The mold is the opposite of the glowing, free-flowing liquid. But that rigid mold is the only thing that allows the metal to cool, stabilize, and solidify into a strong, precise tool like the blade of the axe we see embedded in the stump in the image.
The daily routine, the chopping of the wood, the carrying of the water is the rigid mold for your consciousness. It provides the external structure when the internal structure is still in flux. The framework prescribes adhering to a schedule of humble, concrete tasks precisely because they demand your presence without requiring your ego.
So it doesn't matter if you are living in an isolated mountain monastery sweeping a stone courtyard, or if you are sitting in a modern high-rise office formatting a quarterly earnings report on Excel.
Same thing.
The fundamental mechanical instruction is identical. Tend to the bare necessities with total, unresisting attention.
The setting is irrelevant. The internal mechanics are everything. Which brings us to a specific integration practice outlined here called the containment task.
I love this part.
Yeah, it is designed to train the mind to stay in the mold. The instruction is to pick one humble, repetitive daily task that you normally rush through or try to distract yourself from. Maybe it's washing the dishes by hand. Maybe it's folding a basket of laundry. Maybe it's your 45-minute commute on the train.
Think about your own life for a second. When you do the dishes, what are you usually doing? You've probably got your AirPods in, you're listening to a podcast, you're mentally arguing with your boss about something that happened 3 hours ago, and you're planning what to watch on Netflix later.
Everyone does it.
Your hands are in the sink, but your consciousness is scattered across 3 different timelines and virtual realities.
The containment task asks you to strip all of that away. For just that one task, do it with total attention, as if it were the highest ritual. No audiobooks, no daydreaming, no planning for tomorrow. You use the raw, physical, somatic data of the task, the specific temperature of the dishwater, the rough texture of the sponge, the weight of the ceramic plate to literally contain your consciousness.
Your hands become the anchor holding the volatile mind in place. When the mind tries to escape into the future or the past, you gently pull it back to the sensation of the water.
Exactly. You are teaching your nervous system that it is safe to exist in the mundane present without the constant buzzing stimulation of the ego's narratives.
Okay, so doing chores with intense focus is a brilliant tool for stabilizing the individual. You're alone in your kitchen, washing a mug, totally anchored in the present. But what about other people? Because human beings are messy.
Very messy.
Right. If the social game is just a rigid set of illusions and human interaction is full of drama and posturing, wouldn't it be far more efficient for the newly liberated practitioner to just go live in a cabin in the woods? I mean, if society is a game, why bother interacting with it at all once you've seen the strings?
It is the most common temptation at this stage of development, the allure of the hermit. But the framework explicitly warns against isolation during the Albedo phase. Unless a person is committed to a highly supervised, formally hermetic path within a tradition, retreating into total isolation is actually a massive liability. It leads directly to what is termed a feedback loop of eccentricity.
A feedback loop of eccentricity. Let's break down how that happens mechanically, because we've all seen a version of this. The person who goes on a 6-month silent retreat, reads a bunch of esoteric texts, cuts off all their friends, and when they finally emerge, they are totally ungrounded.
Oh, yeah.
They speak in this weird, slow, whispery voice. They refuse to engage with basic reality, and they act like they're floating above the rest of the mortal realm.
That is the exact pathology the text is warning against. What happens mechanically in isolation is that the mind, lacking the friction of the external world, begins to spin its own new mythologies. The ego, which you thought you dismantled, sneaks back in through the back door.
It's tricky like that.
It really is. It realizes It can no longer get validation by being the richest or the smartest, so it decides to get validation by being the most spiritual or the most detached. This is the inflation of the spiritual ego. It's wearing a monk's robe instead of a tailored suit, but the underlying machinery of superiority is identical.
So how does interacting with society prevent that? If society is full of ego, won't it just drag you back down?
Not if you utilize it correctly. Interaction with ordinary people, people who are completely embedded in the daily grind, who are stressed about their mortgages and annoyed by traffic, provides necessary friction. It acts as a grounding wire. You cannot float away into a spiritual superiority complex if your neighbor desperately needs help jump-starting their car in the snow.
Right, the snow doesn't care about your aura.
Exactly. The physical reality of other people's needs forces you to translate your profound internal silence into appropriate, functional, helpful social behavior.
Which introduces the concept of service as stabilisation. We use service to keep ourselves tethered to the earth, but the framework makes a point here that I found deeply counterintuitive, and I want to really explore the mechanics of it. It argues that this service is not necessarily born out of emotional compassion.
Right. It challenges our core assumption about what it means to help people. We tend to think that service must be fueled by a warm, fuzzy, overwhelming feeling of love for humanity.
Exactly. If I'm helping you, it's because my heart bleeds for you.
But the framework warns that emotional compassion can very easily become just another sticky attachment. You start identifying as the great helper. Your ego feeds on the narrative of being the savior who feels so deeply for the suffering of others. Instead, the text describes service at this stage not as a moral imperative, but as a structural recognition.
A structural recognition. Let's dig into the physics of that.
Think about the economy of energy within a human being. Before the breakthrough, almost all of your psychological energy is circling inward. It is being burned up to maintain the ego. You are constantly scanning the environment for threats to your self-image, calculating how to get more status, defending your opinions.
It sounds exhausting when you put it like that.
It is a closed, inward-looping circuit that requires massive amounts of joules to maintain.
It's like a black hole sucking all the light and energy inward.
Precisely. Now, what happens when the negrito phase collapses the black hole? The obsession with self-interest is removed from the system, but the energy itself doesn't disappear. By the simple laws of psychological physics, if the energy is no longer required to circle inward to feed the ego, it naturally and effortlessly flows outward into the environment.
Wow. So helping your neighbor jumpstart their car isn't about you being a saint. It is a mechanical inevitability. It's like water flowing down a hill once a dam is destroyed. The water doesn't flow downward because it's compassionate water that wants to nourish the valley. It flows downward because there is no longer a concrete structure holding it back, and gravity naturally takes over.
That is the exact mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Service connects the practitioner to the web of life through pure action rather than concept. If you are sitting around conceptually thinking about how enlightened and compassionate you are stuck in the spiritual ego.
Right.
If you are just practically helping someone carry their groceries because the bags are heavy and your hands happen to be free, you are grounded in reality. You are acting as a clear conduit for the energy without demanding credit for it.
I love the gritty realism of this. You chop the wood, you carry the water, you help your neighbor mechanically, you stay grounded. But let's be brutally honest for a second. Let's look at how this actually plays out in the real world. You are driving to the grocery store to buy food for your neighbor. You are totally present. And then a minivan cuts you off aggressively, almost running you off the road.
The ultimate stress test.
Instantly, your heart rate spikes to 130 beats per minute. Your hands grip the steering wheel like a vice. Heat flushes your face, and you are absolutely furious. You want to lay on the horn, roll down the window, and scream.
Yeah.
And as you are sitting there vibrating with rage, the cognitive dissonance hits you. You think, wait a minute. I did the shadow work. I went through the Negredo phase. I realized the profound truth of anatta. I know the self is an illusion. Why am I currently vibrating with homicidal rage at a Dodge Caravan? Didn't the grand spiritual awakening delete this bug from my software?
It is the most frustrating, humiliating experience for anyone on a path of development. The return of the old demons when you thought you had outgrown them. But the source framework makes a critical, absolutely essential distinction here that saves us from despair. It separates the moment of insight from the duration of transformation.
Insight versus transformation. Break down how those operate differently on a mechanical level.
The framework leans heavily on the Abhidhamma, an ancient, highly analytical system of Buddhist psychology that maps consciousness with incredible precision. In this system, insight occurs in discrete, instantaneous mind moments, A flash of seeing the absolute truth. It happens in a fraction of a millisecond. You see through the illusion of the ego, pop. The insight is achieved.
It's binary. You didn't see it, and now you do.
Exactly. However, the personality, the biological and psychological machine that you pilot through the world is described as a mountain of karmic inertia. Karma, in this context, isn't some mystical cosmic scoreboard.
Yeah.
It is the raw law of cause and effect, is momentum.
Mm.
For decades, you have been building up conditioned habits, carving deep neural pathways in your brain, and hardwiring knee-jerk emotional reflexes into your nervous system.
So a realization in the mind doesn't instantly rewire the biology of the nervous system.
Right. A mountain of momentum doesn't just vanish the second you realize it's made of dirt. Even after a profound realization of not self, the vast machinery of the old personality will continue to spin simply due to sheer accumulated momentum.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's use a visceral analogy here because I think it perfectly captures the mechanics of karma. Think of your conditioned personality as a massive, miles-long freight train. It weighs hundreds of thousands of tons. For the last 30, 40, or 50 years of your life, that train has been barreling down the tracks at 90 miles an hour, fueled by ambition, fear, trauma, and ego.
A lot of fuel.
Right. Now you have this profound awakening. You have the insight. That moment of insight is the exact equivalent of slamming your hand down on the emergency brakes in the locomotive.
A perfect mechanical translation.
Right.
You hit the brakes, the engine stops generating new forward propulsion.
Right. The engine is cut. No more coal is being shoveled into the furnace. But does a 100,000-ton freight train stop the millisecond you cut the engine? Absolutely not.
No way.
The sheer mass and momentum of that miles-long train means the wheels are going to lock up, they're going to spark, they're going to scream against the steel tracks, and that train is going to keep violently sliding forward for another 3 miles before it finally shudders to a halt.
The screeching wheels, the sparks, the unstoppable forward motion that is the karmic inertia the text is talking about.
So when you get furious in traffic after your awakening, that isn't a failure of your insight. The brakes haven't failed. It is literally just the mechanical momentum of the train sliding down the tracks. The neural pathways are firing out of pure habit.
Which is such a profoundly forgiving, scientifically grounded way to view our own relapses. To map out exactly what this slowing train looks like over time, the text provides Table 61, the shift in engagement, which contrasts 4 major domains of life, before insight versus after insight. It shows how the momentum slowly shifts. Let's look at the mechanics of each domain.
Let's do it. The first domain is motivation. Before insight, motivation is driven by acquisition, status, and emotional hunger. You are trying to fill a void. You want the promotion so people respect you. After insight, as the train slows down, motivation shifts entirely to functional necessity and responsiveness.
Think about the mechanics of eating. Before insight, you might eat out of anxiety, boredom, or a desire for comfort. You are using food to manage the ego's distress.
Emotional eating, yeah.
After insight, the momentum shifts. You eat simply because the biological organism requires caloric fuel to maintain homeostasis. You work to provide value and sustain your physical existence, not to prove you are superior to your high school classmates. The action looks identical from the outside, but the internal engine powering it has completely changed.
The second domain is routine. We touched on this with the water buckets, but it's worth deepening. Before insight, routine is seen as a burden. It's an obstacle. It's the boring stuff you have to suffer through before the real life begins on the weekend or on vacation.
And that mindset creates massive internal friction. You spend your Tuesday angry that it's Friday. After insight, routine is recognized as the ultimate grounding practice of the present moment. The chore is the life. There is no future utopia to escape to. There is only the texture of the present action.
Domain 3 is identity, and this is where it gets really sharp. Before insight, identity is constructed through roles and social feedback. You deeply believe that you are your job title. You are your reputation. And because you believe that, if someone insults your reputation, your nervous system reacts as if they are literally attacking your physical existence. It triggers a fight-or-flight survival response.
But after insight, identity is recognized as a temporary functional interface. It's an avatar you use to log into the social world, but it isn't you. If someone insults the avatar, you might register the data, but your nervous system doesn't panic because you know the avatar isn't your core reality.
Which leads perfectly into the fourth domain, conflict. Before insight, conflict is fundamentally about defending the self-image against a perceived threat. Every argument is a battle for existential survival.
After insight, conflict is simply observing the mechanics of cause and effect. You see the disagreement not as a personal attack, but as two conflicting sets of conditions colliding in space. Yeah, if a rock falls off a cliff and hits your car, you don't take it personally. You just observe that gravity and poor structural integrity caused a collision. The integrated mind views a screaming coworker the exact same way as a temporary collision of stress conditions, not a referendum on your worth.
Think about your own life again. The text offers a brilliant clarifying question here. It asks, when an unwholesome habit recurs, when you snap at your partner, or you stress eat, or you get paralyzed by anxiety over an email, do you judge yourself for failing? Or do you recognize it as a mechanical wheel slowly losing momentum? Because if you judge yourself, if you say, I'm a failure, I shouldn't be angry, you are actually throwing more coal into the engine. You are using ego to fight ego.
Exactly. The narrative of I failed requires a strong sense of I. It reinforces the very structure you were trying to dismantle.
But if you can look at your own anger and say, that is just the screeching wheels of the train, the biology is firing out of habit, it takes the moral panic out of personal growth.
It does. But we must be careful not to mistake forgiveness for passivity. The framework makes it clear that we don't just sit back and let the train run over us or our relationships. We have to actively manage this slow deceleration. And to do that, it provides a highly technical mechanism outlined in Table 62, the habit interruption loop.
Yes, the brakes. We know the train is rolling. How do we actually apply the brakes effectively without accidentally hitting the gas? Table 62 gives us a 4-step process for wearing down the mountain of karmic inertia. Let's walk through the mechanics of this using a real-world scenario. Let's say you are in a high-stakes meeting at work. You've been leading a project for 6 months. A colleague casually leans back and lightly criticizes your strategy in front of the CEO.
A perfect crucible. Let's trace the loop. Step 1 is arising. The colleague's comment is the stimulus. Instantly, before you can even consciously process it, the old biological and psychological programming fires. Defensiveness arises. Your amygdala perceives a threat to your social status.
Heart rate goes up.
Heat flushes your chest. Cortisol spikes. Your mind immediately starts generating aggressive counter-arguments to humiliate them and protect your territory. The framework notes a crucial point here. The action required from you in step 1 is none. It is automatic. You cannot stop the arising.
Right. The spark has ignited. The biology is doing what millions of years of evolution trained it to do. But then we hit step 2. Recognition. Awareness mates the reaction. You internally observe, defensiveness is arising, or heat is expanding in the chest. The action required here is to apply sati, the Pali word for mindfulness. But let's explain the mechanics of why sati works. How does objective observation actually change anything?
It is a neurological intervention. When you are fully identified with the anger, when you believe I am angry and I must attack the amygdala is hijacking your brain. You are operating purely on reactive survival instincts. But the moment you apply sati, the moment you label the sensation objectively, like heat is in the chest, you are literally rerouting the electrical signal in your brain away from the primitive amygdala and up into the prefrontal cortex, the center of executive function and objective observation.
You are stepping out of the movie and into the projection booth.
Exactly. And this leads to the most critical and most misunderstood step of the loop, step 3, decoupling. The I does not identify with the anger. The thought is no longer I am angry. The thought becomes there is an energetic pattern of anger currently passing through this physical organism.
Right.
The action required is to withhold assent or fuel. You refuse to grab onto the emotion and build a narrative around it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't speak the defensive counterargument. You just let the heat burn in your chest without giving it an outlet.
Now, I have to push back here. I can hear people listening to this and raising a massive red flag, identifying my feelings as impersonal mechanical events. Doesn't this just turn us into cold, detached, sociopathic robots? Isn't feeling and expressing our emotions a fundamental part of a healthy human psychology? If I just coldly observe my anger or my grief as a mechanical event, aren't I just repressing it under the guise of spiritual advancement?
It is the most common fear when encountering this framework, but it is based on a misunderstanding of what decoupling actually is. Decoupling is the exact opposite of repression.
Oh, really?
Yeah. What is repression? Repression is when the ego feels threatened by an uncomfortable emotion, so it shoves it down into the dark, numbs it out, and pretends it isn't there. It refuses to feel it. Decoupling is pulling the emotion up into the bright, searing light of full awareness. You feel the physical sensations intimately, the burning, the tension, the accelerated heartbeat. but you simply refuse to let those sensations drive a car.
So you still feel the heat, you still feel the adrenaline in the meeting.
You feel it more clearly and intensely than ever before because you aren't distracted by the story in your head about why you are angry. The framework emphasizes that observing these impulses as impersonal mechanical events is a long, slow abrasion of the old self. You aren't repressing the emotion, you are starving it. You are refusing to throw the gasoline of narrative onto the fire of the biological reaction. You feel it completely, you just don't become it.
You feel it completely, you just don't become it. That is a massive paradigm shift, and that allows us to reach step 4. Dissolution. Because you withheld the fuel, because you didn't snap back at your colleague, because you didn't spin into a narrative of victimhood, the energy of the reaction naturally fades. Biological reactions have a half-life. If they aren't fed by psychological stories, they burn out. The action required in step 4 is simply to observe the cessation. You watch the heat leave your chest, you watch the train slow down just a little bit more.
And every single time you successfully complete that 4-step loop, a tiny microscopic piece of the mountain of karmic inertia is worn away. It requires immense, grinding patience. It is not a magical disappearance. It is the literal biological and psychological rewiring of a human being, and that takes duration.
Let's zoom out and look at the macro implications of this. We are patiently wearing down the mountain. We are decoupling from our conditioned reflexes. We are realizing that our identities, our job titles, and our social roles are just temporary functional interfaces. If all of that is true, how do we actually interact with society without sounding completely insane?
That's the real challenge.
Yeah, if I realize that my job title is an illusion and money is just a conceptual agreement, how do I go to the bank and ask for a mortgage to buy a house without coming across like a lunatic?
This brings us to perhaps the most sophisticated high-wire act of the entire Albedo chapter. The framework introduces a concept that solves this exact problem, the 2 registers of truth. The integrated alchemist must learn to navigate 2 simultaneous parallel realities. If you fail to distinguish between the mechanics of these 2 registers, the text warns you will end up in either severe social dysfunction or profound spiritual hypocrisy.
Let's break down these 2 realities. The first register is called apparent reality, or in Pali, sammutisaka. What are the mechanics of apparent reality?
Apparent reality is the world of names, forms, social roles, money, institutions, laws, and boundaries. It is the grand, agreed-upon fiction that allows 8 billion human primates to coordinate their actions without killing each other. It is the operating system of society. Now, to the ordinary worldling, someone who has never questioned the nature of their existence, this apparent reality is the only reality. They truly believe that the numbers in their bank account are absolute intrinsic measures of their worth, safety, and existence.
And then you have the second register, conditioned reality or paramathisaka. This is the absolute truth. It is the flow of impermanent phenomena, entirely void of a permanent self, driven purely by the mechanics of cause and effect. This is the reality you tap into during the breakthrough. It is the raw source code of consciousness beneath the operating system.
Exactly. The source code versus the user interface. And the tension, the friction of a lived life arises because people constantly mix these 2 registers up. The framework identifies 2 distinct catastrophic errors that occur when you blur the lines. The first is the worldling error, which is mistaking the relative truth for the absolute truth. This is the person who believes their job title is their actual soul, and if they lose their job, they suffer a total psychological collapse because they feel they have literally ceased to exist.
We see that everywhere. It's the default state of modern anxiety. But the second error, the novice error, is almost more dangerous for people on a path of self-improvement. The novice error is using the absolute truth to dismiss the relative truth. The text gives a perfectly blunt example. I don't need to pay rent because money is an illusion.
Right. In modern psychological terms, this is often referred to as a spiritual bypass. It is using high-level, absolute spiritual concepts to avoid dealing with basic, messy human responsibilities, debts, and traumas. It is a profound failure of integration. You see this when someone acts unethically or hurts someone and then dismisses the damage by saying, well, it's all just an illusion anyway, nothing really matters. It is using enlightenment as an excuse for sociopathy.
I think the best way to conceptualize how to navigate this is to think about playing a massive, high-stakes, multiplayer video game. Imagine you are playing an incredibly complex RPG. To make the game work, to be a good teammate, and to actually progress, you have to take the rules of apparent reality absolutely seriously. You have to care about your health points, you have to gather gold, you have to complete quests, and you have to strategize with your guild. You engage with the game's mechanics with total precision and focus.
But
If you ever forget that you were sitting on a couch in your living room holding a plastic controller, if you actually believe that you are the level 80 elf mage, and when your character dies in the game, you suffer a genuine nervous breakdown in real life, you have lost your mind. That is the worldling error.
Well,
Conversely, if you sit on the couch and say, this game is just pixels on a screen, it's all an illusion, none of it is real, and you just drop the controller and let your character stand in the fire while your teammates scream at you, well, that is the novice error. You are ruining the game for everyone because you refuse to engage with the apparent reality of the interface.
that is a flawless analogy for the albedo phase. The master alchemist, as the text describes them, operates exactly like the master gamer. They respect apparent reality as the necessary medium of communication and function. They don't rebel against the game. They play the role required by the moment: employee, parent, citizen, friend, taxpayer, with total precision, care, and empathy. They respect the rules of the realm, but internally, fundamentally, they remain eternally anchored in conditioned reality. They know they are holding the controller. They never confuse the avatar for the soul.
And the framework places a very specific constraint on how we talk about this, which highlights the danger. It warns against confusing the useful story with the technical mechanism.
Yes, it is a demand for radical internal honesty. In apparent reality, we often need to use myths or stories to function. You might tell yourself a useful story about your career trajectory to help organize a 5-year plan. You might use the concept of my family to foster a cohesive home environment. But the framework demands that you must never let those useful fictions bleed into your technical understanding of your own consciousness.
You can wear the costume for the sake of the play, but you must never look in the mirror and believe the costume has become your skin. In the domain of albedo, clarity of the underlying mechanism is paramount. You must know exactly how the machinery of your mind works, even as you enthusiastically participate in the grand illusion of the world.
It is a beautiful, delicate tightrope walk. To be fully in the world, engaged with all its messiness and suffering, but entirely not of it.
So we've chopped the wood, we've carried the water, we are patiently wearing down the screeching wheels of our karmic inertia by interrupting our habit loops. We are wearing the costume of society with precision while staying anchored in the absolute truth of non-self. This is a massive amount of rigorous, unglamorous work. Where does this path ultimately lead? As we finally approach the end of this albedo phase, what is the culmination of all this dreadful sobriety and disciplined routine?
The framework points toward a final shift that is quite remarkable. It states that the culmination of this integration phase is the natural, unforced emergence of something called thaumaturgy.
Thaumaturgy. Now, let's clear the air immediately, because when people hear the word thaumaturgy, they think of fantasy novels.
Right.
They think of occult rituals, wizards casting spells, or some kind of law of attraction magic where you manifest a Ferrari by thinking about it really hard. But given everything we've discussed about the brutal mechanics of this text, I'm guessing thaumaturgy doesn't mean shooting fireballs out of your hands.
You would be entirely correct to be skeptical. The framework explicitly redefines thaumaturgy, stripping away all the spooky mystical veneer. It defines it strictly as a subtle capacity to influence the environment, not through force, not through imposing your will, but through profound alignment and the total removal of internal resistance.
So what does this all mean? Influence through alignment and the removal of resistance. Let's really expand on this. What does that actually look like in practice? How does removing your internal friction give you power over the external environment?
Think about how much energy a typical unintegrated person wastes on internal friction when they try to achieve something. Let's use a high-stakes scenario. Imagine a massive, tense corporate merger negotiation, or perhaps a bitter family inheritance dispute.
Okay, let's look at the family inheritance dispute. 2 siblings fighting over an estate.
Perfect. Let's observe the sibling operating from the unexamined ego. They enter the room, and their energy is entirely scattered. They want the money, but they also want to punish their sibling for a childhood slight. They are terrified of looking weak. They are anxious about what the lawyers think of them. They are constantly fighting their own contradictory impulses. When they take action, when they speak or make a demand, it is clumsy, it is forced, and it reeks of desperation and hostility.
And because it is forced, it creates an equal and opposite reaction from the environment. The other sibling immediately digs their heels in. The lawyers get defensive. The friction in the room multiplies. It's like trying to push a square peg into a round hole by just hitting it harder with a hammer.
Exactly. The forceful ego approach generates massive resistance. Now let's replace that person with the integrated alchemist who has mastered the albedo phase. They entered the exact same room, facing the exact same dispute. But they have zero internal friction. They have decoupled their identity from the outcome. They aren't trying to prove they're the good sibling. They aren't afraid of losing. They are purely anchored in conditioned reality, observing the mechanics of cause and effect in the room.
So how do they behave?
They observe the emotional states of everyone else as impersonal mechanical events. They see their siblings' anger not as a personal attack, but as a temporary collision of stress conditions. Because they have no internal resistance to protect, they can listen perfectly. They find the exact point of leverage, the true underlying need of the sibling, stripped of the posturing. When the integrated person finally speaks, their action is singular, precise, and perfectly aligned with the reality of the situation. They don't push against the resistance. They step out of its way and guide the momentum where it naturally wants to flow.
Like martial arts, like Aikido. You don't block the punch, you align with the energy of the punch and guide the opponent to the floor using their own momentum.
Precisely. And to an outside observer, to the lawyers in the room, it looks almost like magic. They watch this incredibly tense, impossible situation effortlessly resolve itself because one person simply refused to provide any friction. That is thaumaturgy. It is the science of removing yourself from your own way.
The framework has an incredible line about this. It suggests that the true occultist is often just a mystic with a notebook, someone who observes the natural laws of consciousness with scientific rigor. It strips the magic away and replaces it with profound fluid dynamics applied to human interaction.
True mastery of reality looks a lot like profound common sense applied with unwavering, egoless consistency. It is the ability to perceive the matrix of cause and effect so clearly that your actions naturally reweave the fabric of the situation without anyone even noticing you did anything at all.
But, and this is the absolute crux of the entire chapter, the ultimate reality check. You cannot access that level of alignment. You cannot unlock that thaumaturgy by just reading a book about it or wishing for it.
No. You cannot manipulate the river if you're still drowning in it. You cannot access the subtle power of alignment until you are deeply, thoroughly grounded in the humility of the dreadful sobriety. You have to master the heavy buckets of water. You have to endure the screeching of the train wheels without feeding the engine. You have to chop the wood.
You have to earn the clarity through the containment task. The framework anchors this entire towering philosophy with a final, beautiful quote from the Dhammapada, verse 168. It simply reads, "The way is not in the sky. The way is in the heart."
It is the ultimate reminder to bring our soaring, abstract spiritual ambitions back down to the earth, back to the grounding reality of your own internal somatic experience, your immediate practical life, and the dishwater in your sink.
The way is not in the sky. It's not in the fireworks. It's in the heart, and it's in the hands holding the sponge. Let's do a quick recap of the massive ground we've covered today. We started by dismantling the myth of the mountaintop, replacing the expectation of permanent ecstasy with the profound, functional, dreadful sobriety of the return to reality. We explored the architecture of routine as a necessary, rigid mold for volatile new consciousness. We looked at how engaging with others and acting in mechanical service provides the necessary friction to prevent the inflation of a spiritual ego. We mapped the sheer mass of karmic inertia, recognizing that the freight train of the personality takes time to slow down. And we broke down the mechanics of the four-step habit interruption loop to patiently wear it away. And finally, we navigated the two registers of truth, learning to play our roles in the video game of apparent reality while remaining forever anchored in conditioned reality, which ultimately opens the door to the subtle, frictionless power of thaumaturgy.
It is a rigorous, demanding path. It asks for the death of our most cherished delusions. But ultimately, it is a deeply liberating one. It frees us from the exhausting, impossible burden of having to be special.
It frees us to just be functional. Now, before we sign off, think about your own life. We have spent this entire deep dive looking at how the individual navigates these concepts, how you, personally, wear the costume of apparent reality while knowing it's just a game. But consider this macro implication. What happens to the apparent reality of our society, our laws, our economies, our social hierarchies, our rigid institutions, if a critical mass of people simultaneously wake up to the mechanics we've discussed today? If millions of people realize that money, status, and corporate ladders aren't absolute truths, but they choose to continue playing the game purely out of functional necessity and service, does the game itself begin to change its rules? If the players in the RPG all realize they are holding controllers and they stop fighting over the digital gold and start playing purely to optimize the experience for everyone, does the apparent reality become something entirely new? Think about it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of the mind. Stay curious, keep observing the momentum of your own train, and of course, don't forget to go do your laundry.